Hello and welcome back to Custode Central. We had a new FAQ drop yesterday, which changed, I think, quite a lot about the game. Um, I just finished recording like a 45-minute video on secondaries, and this came out and it kind of changed everything. But it also reinforced a lot of the conclusions that I'd reached already. It just pushes those conclusions even harder. So just before we start, I realized I'd made an error in my previous video about tanglefoot versus an opponent who's rerolling charges. Basically, I'd used the numbers from 3d6 discard lowest instead of 2d6 reroll. So just for completeness, the new numbers are just here. I don't think it really changes very much, but just for completeness, I just wanted to put the correct numbers up on here, and it still doesn't really change the conclusions as to when you would want to kind of use tanglefoot. So usually I would still only use it on a 6-inch charge, because that leaves your opponent on about a 41% from 92%, and I think that's still about the cutoff for me as to when I would use tanglefoot. So let's now jump into the changes for custodes. So point changes first. Nothing has updated on any of the Forge World models, and most of the GW range stay the same. Apart from Custodian Guard with Spears dropped 4 points down to 45, and the Custodian Guards with Sword and Shield dropped from 56 to 52. So that's all very nice. I don't think it's going to be kind of game changing. Most people are only going to get maybe 20-40 points on the list from this, and effectively, if you were bringing these guys anyway, you're just happy with the points decrease. That's pretty nice. On the other hand, Alaris Terminators, they went up by 5 points, so now the guys with spears are 70 points and the guys with axes are 75, and which means they're now the same price as Aquilon Terminators. And I mean, they're not the same unit, but they're very, very similar, because they are both Terminators. They both have access to the Auramite stratagem to ignore AP1, AP2, and the FAQ has kind of clarified what happens with order of operations if you get hit with a -1 weapon, and then that has a let's say it's a Space Marine and Tactical Doctrine, and now it goes to -2. Do you apply the stratagem first and then it gets bumped back up to -1? But now we just know how that works. Kind of works both ways though, because if they had a -2 weapon, and then their doctrine puts them to -3, for example, with like a Thunderhammer or something, so now that stratagem doesn't work. So we're not going to get into a discussion as to kind of what's the better unit, Alaris versus Aquilons here, but just interesting to note that now they are exactly the same price with the axes. And generally, unless you're really, really squeezed for points, I think you should be taking the axes. It just gives you more target flexibility in your list. Quite a big drop we've had is for Virtus Praetors. These are the bikes with the Hurricanes or the Salvo launchers. They've dropped from 95 points to 85 points. I think the comparison now with Last Pulsars, which are still 115 points versus 85, they are now way too expensive, I think, for the comparison cost. So if you want a unit of bikes, I think you can leave the Last Pulsars for now. Maybe they get a points decrease in the new codex, but just when you compare these prices, it's just too good, I think, to consider taking Last Pulsars still. I also think we're going to see a small increase in vehicles probably in the meta after the changes to the GT mission pack and the way secondaries are scored for killing vehicles. So I mean, this just makes it even better. There were kind of 3 schools of thought on bikes prior to this. That was 1, they're too expensive in terms of points per wound. 2, there were the people that said, it kind of doesn't matter, bikes are still really good, and it's a really good way of getting anti-tank shooting and mobility into your list. And the third one, they're kind of on the fence. I think with a 10-point drop, you can definitely, if you were on the fence before, you're probably loving life. Try it out. If you still hate them, I would say just try it out. It's not a massive decrease in points, but it is pretty significant for a squad of 5. That's 50 points right there. That's like an extra dude that you can get. The Vexilla Praetor, the dude with the banner, if you run him with the spear, he's now dropped from 120 points to 90 points. There was a lot of discussion about whether in the update they'd forgotten to account for the cost of the banner. I think rules as written, the banner is now free, and the GW app also has it as a 0-point kind of addition. They might still change that, but that is gives us a bit more hope, I suppose, in the sense of that now being a 90-point model. And I think at 90 points, It's very good value in terms of what -1 can do for your army. Most of the reason why you probably wouldn't want to run a Vex is not so much to do with the cost of the model, I don't think, but more in terms of opportunity cost of the slot, because obviously the elite slot is pretty hotly contested in the Custodes army. A few quick rules updates for Valerian and Aaliyah, and they now have the keyword so they can be kind of legal in a battle-forged army. Still don't think they're good units, so it doesn't matter that much for competitive play, but for, if you're like a fluffy player, cool to be able to run it in your list. Ares and Orion, they can now deploy turn 1 as long as the base fits inside your deployment zone. The fact that the model kind of overhangs doesn't matter so much. You just have to try and get it. I think you can only overhang the model if it doesn't otherwise fit in your deployment zone. So this does now mean you should be able to have turn 1 with these models, and you don't have Ares Gate anymore. And Unstoppable Destroyer was clarified. That means if you get base, you can't consolidate kind of in any direction that you would usually be able to do. I think most people were probably using the rules this way already, but if they weren't, well, now you know what the ruling is on that. So we got a few points. If you ran Terminators, you might have lost a few points. It's probably a wash or like a slight win depending on what your list looked like. But these are all very welcome changes from my perspective. Now, in terms of what GT actually changed, GT I think changed quite a lot to do with the game. So the first thing that immediately sprung to me is when you roll off for who gets first, if you win, you just go first now. And before you used to be able to choose. I think that I don't personally like this change as a Custodes player, because even though the data indicates that going first as Custodes is still better than going second, in my own games, and I suppose that's a function of my list and the terrain that I play on, I would very frequently choose to go second because I thought that helped my win condition. So I'm not personally a fan of this, but and I think it kind of reduces some of the skill in the game a little bit. My suspicion is they were trying to even out win rates between first and second a bit more, and this is kind of a dirty way to do it. But I think it will probably work a bit by reducing the advantage that some lists can have by choosing. So here I think it's just worth noting that Castellar Mark is a relic that lets you redeploy the unit that has the Castellar Mark and a unit within 6. I used to run this in my list. I still do run it in my current list, although it's not been updated for the new rules. But I think this is now going to be even more useful going forward now that it's so swingy as to who goes first. The other change is that the second turn player can score primaries in turn 5 at the end of their turn instead of at the end of the command phase as usual. It's actually a pretty big change, and I think they did this to try and reduce the first turn advantage, because obviously going first usually gives you a massive advantage in terms of scoring primaries, because you get to move your models up on the board first, you put them onto the objectives first. You're always counter punching, trading. You always tend to be trading kind of objectives on your turn, and you're trying desperately to hold on to them for one turn to kind of score the primary. But this way, you get final say at the end of turn 5. So for this, I think for a Custodes army, this is pretty good, because we have we have some fast obsec units that are really good at flipping objectives, I think. And so the ones that really spring to mind here are the bike units and the Venatari, because they're obsec, they move really fast, and they can kill a bunch of stuff if they need to. The other change that is pretty big in my mind is they have changed While We Stand We Fight to be your 3 most expensive units rather than your 3 most expensive models. And they have clarified in here that this includes units that split. So, if you really wanted to do something like Unleash the Lions to make it really, really hard for your opponent to kill your unit, you could do. It's pretty expensive to do it in terms of CP, and the fact that you're losing access to stratagems, or it becomes very inefficient to put a stratagem on a 1 model unit. But that is something that you can do. But how does this actually affect a Custodes army? So previously, if you ran like a Telemon, it's almost guaranteed to be your While We Stand We Fight unit. It's not necessarily the case anymore. It still might be, but it's just something to keep in mind. The other thing is that our characters are very unlikely to be While We Stand We Fight units. So this means you can use them much more aggressively, whereas before, if you had, if you took What We Stand We Fight and they landed on your characters, you tended to kind of hold them back a little bit, especially in the early turns, because if you don't want to be throwing these points away, and you want to kind of incentivize your opponent to, I don't want to say YOLO, but maybe potentially overextend themselves, trying to kill your units that have What We Stand We Fight to deny you those secondary points. So I think now we need to very carefully consider an army construction. What would your While We Stand We Fight unit be if you ended up in a spot where you wanted to choose it? And from my perspective, without having played with this new change yet, just kind of thinking about it, if this lands on your bikes or your Venatari, which I think it quite likely is, I don't think this is necessarily good for us. I think it's also going to land on your Terminators. This is better for us than bikes and Venatari, just because I think Terminators can survive quite a lot of punishment, especially by being able to ignore AP1, AP2. If you stack a Vex on them, you stack other defensive buffs. It makes it very, very hard to kill, and it reduces the amount of kind of shooting or melee that pose like a real threat to them. Because obviously, if you're saving on 2s, you can almost kind of ignore the threat of certain units. So how does this affect your opponent's picking While We Stand We Fight? Because obviously it's going to affect everyone else's army as well. So there are some situations I've been in where you end up in a very, very weird defensive game of 9th, where you would both play very defensively, you would both pick While We Stand We Fight, you would both pick banners, and you effectively aren't playing, like in my mind, you're not really playing 40k, you're playing the points game, which I suppose is 40k has turned into a points game now, but it could result in some pretty, I suppose they are pretty tactical, but it could result in some very boring games. And these are the kind of matchups where if your opponent took While We Stand We Fight and you didn't, you could have just automatically lost, because you would have been forced to play very aggressively to try and get your kill secondaries, and they're trying to hold them back, and you were basically pushing into a very, very defensible position by your opponent. So now this kind of is much less likely to happen now. So, for an example, a sisters list with 3 canonesses, where they're the most expensive model in their army, but obviously they're not very expensive themselves. They could just reserve them back, put them right in the back of their deployment zone, completely screen them out. You're never going to get to them without tabling their whole army, which effectively means they've locked up 15 points automatically. That can't really happen now because it has to be on the most expensive units. So I think the change to While We Stand We Fight really favors armies that have expensive units that have long range shooting. And the reason for this is you don't really want your While We Stand We Fight units like all up in the front, in melee range, in shooting range of absolutely everything, right? It's much, you're trying to keep these units alive, so it's much better if you have them at the back of your army. They're still able to do their damage, and they happen to land on that. And I don't think that the Custodes armies really has that many good units for this. So kind of my conclusion on While We Stand We Fight changes is I think it makes Custodes a bit weaker, because we're now not able to pick this as often, or even if we pick it, it's not going to score as reliably for us, because it's probably going to land on our units of bikes, Venatari, or Terminators quite frequently. And these are our kind of playmaker units. These are the units that we use aggressively. We push them up the board. We try and flip objectives with them. We try and kill key targets with them. But these are also the units which our opponents are probably prioritizing anyway, because these are our very killy units. So from my perspective, in close games, they're very frequently going to die completely. You have the dream where you use the unit, there's one guy left alive, and you just run them away and you get your 5 points for While We Stand We Fight. Like, yes, that could happen. I think it's going to be very hard to do reliably in close games, because if they're in combat and they roll a little bit better than average or something, you've now lost that unit. It's not the same as being able to really know which model it is, hold them back in the back of your army, and like if you wanted 15 points, you could have probably locked up 15 points, assuming you didn't get tabled or something like that. So the other kind of thing to note is that the Telemon in particular, sometimes you just get a matchup where your opponent their army just wasn't good enough to kill a Telemon. They couldn't if they wanted to kill it, they'd have to, dedicate all of their shooting towards your Telemon. You could have stacked buffs on your Telemon, and that means they're not shooting the rest of your army, so they would have just effectively lost trying to kill it. And in those kind of games, which happens not infrequently, you now no longer have access to this like guaranteed points effectively. So as again, I think Custodes don't have many expensive long-range shooting units other than like the Ares, the Land Raider, and Storm Cannon Telemon. Depends whether you have these units and you really like these units and you think they have good synergy with the rest of your list. But as a result, I'm not too excited about having to pick what we stand we fight if I have Bikes, Venatori, Terminators in my list. And especially if all three of those happen to be my 3 units, just because if you're scoring 15 on this, and these are your units, you've probably just absolutely smashed your opponent anyway. And as a result, it turns it into kind of a win more secondary. So let's look now at how GT 2020 has changed in relation to bring it down. So now you get 1 point for vehicle or monster with 10 wounds or less. Previously you got 2. And now you get 2 points for 11 to 19 wounds. Previously you got 3. Nice little change, which I don't think changes that much, is you get 3 points for 20 wounds or more. So my prediction, just because this is it's a bit of a change for me, but usually I talk more on my experiences and what I feel very comfortable with. But I'm gonna make a prediction here, and I think this is going to change the meta in terms of secondaries quite a lot. Now Melta are still very prevalent with Eradicators, Retributors, which kind of disincentivizes people to take vehicles and monsters. But I think the fact that the scoring system for this has changed quite a lot is that now lists that might have wanted to take 3 or 4 vehicles but previously didn't because they were scared of giving up a secondary now don't have to be that concerned, because if you take 4 tanks now and you're offering up 8 secondary points, it's not a fantastic secondary to take. Obviously you offer it up as an option, but it's not a great scoring one, and so you don't have to feel bad about running these vehicles. So I think a lot of lists are no longer disincentivized to take this additional vehicle. So as a result, I think you should prepare in your army list construction to kind of potentially take out a few more tanks or monsters, and so as a result, it's really good that Bike's got a 10-point reduction. So if we have a look at, so this is a little extract from Goonhammer, and they did a meta review for December 2020 before the updates dropped, obviously. And you'll see here that Bring It Down was picked 33.2% of the time. And that's actually a really high percentage for times actually selected out of eligible times that you could have taken it. And it's actually the second most picked secondary. And that tells you really how common it is for armies to be picking into Bring It Down previously, because with the abundance, with the way that it was scored, you could score quite highly versus a lot of armies with it. And you can see on the average points, it's scoring very high on average points as well. So it was a very popular secondary, it was a very high scoring secondary. And this would have been the same for Custodes as well, from my personal experience. So how important was it? Yeah, lots of people picking it. It was a good secondary to pick. It was high scoring. Custodes were picking it. And so what I really want you to do is kind of think about the lists that you've faced in your previous games. And I think the way that I kind of looked at it, I think very few of these lists are going to give up more than 12 points. And with the new scoring system, if they are giving up 12 points, you're killing a lot of stuff, right? That's 6 decent sized tanks or monsters. And most lists aren't running 6, and if they are, if you've killed them all, you've probably killed 80% of their army, which means again you're kind of winning already. So this turns weirdly into a win more secondary, which I'm not really a fan of. So I think realistically the secondary is mostly dead to us now, because I think most lists are only going to be giving up 6 to 8 points at the end of the game. Obviously they might have a few more tanks or vehicles, but again, if you've killed absolutely everything, then you've probably already won. So in the games where you don't lawnmower your opponent, I think now it's only giving up 6 to 8 instead of maybe like 9 to 11 points, something like that. So it's actually pretty significant for us, because this is one of our secondaries which we're picking pretty often. So if this is now gone, we should look at what Purge the Enemy actually looks like after the update. So Titan Hunter, like, yeah, it's still available. We can still pick it sometimes, but how many Titanic units do you really see? I mean, Knights really aren't in the meta at the moment. Bring It Down is now pretty low scoring. Cut Off the Head, you never taken this. It's just bad. You can just trust me on that. And Assassinate is very, very often a trap, because if you can kill that many characters, that means you've killed all the units around the characters that were giving it Lookout Sir. And if you've killed all those units, again, you tend to be kind of in a strongly winning position already. Now, the kind of counterpoint to that is if you are taking Alaris Terminators and your list has the CP to be running, I think it's Inescapable Vengeance, to be able to target characters and ignore Lookout Sir, Assassinate kind of doesn't look as unattractive now, because now you can just ignore Lookout Sir and you can pop a lot of characters. And there are a lot of characters that are pretty squishy and they will crumble very quickly to -1/2 damage kind of shots, especially if you're doing something like superior fire patterns on them, etc., and re-rolling, hits and wounds, etc. So I don't want to say Assassinate is dead, but if you're not running Alaris, this can be potentially a bit of a trap to take. So let's just think about how often this change is now going to affect us, right? So these are the common opponents where I think I was picking Bring It Down pretty often. So Astra Militarum, it was almost an auto take. It probably still will be an auto take just because they tend to run that many vehicles. It makes our scoring a bit harder, but I don't think it's going to change the matchup that much, because Astra Militarum tends to be a pretty easy matchup for Custodes. Admech, Craftworld Adari, you don't tend to see them that often, but obviously if they're running a lot of vehicles, you now just score less for the vehicles. Chaos if monster heavy, Demon Engine lists. So this is a battle. If they were running kind of a lot of mortifiers, now you're scoring 1 point for the mortifier instead of 2. That can add up, so now you might not be maxing out quite as easily. You might be stuck on 12 points instead of 15 or 10 or something like that. Orcs, if they're going buggy heavy or vehicle heavy in some way, this is probably going to have a bigger impact, because now again it's a 50% reduction in points available. Tyranids, if you're running into the kind of, I don't know, I call that the Nidzilla style list, where you've got Swarm Lord, Flyrants, Tyrants, Demacarons, Hierodules, and they've just got a lot of them. Before it used to be very easy to max score this, but now you might not necessarily be able to do so. You might only get 10 points now, so it's not that good. And Space Marines, if they ran kind of vehicle heavy, it wasn't that common, but if they ran 3 or 4 dreadnoughts, was a pretty good one to take. Now it might not be, especially with the -1s. So I mean, the -1 part isn't new, but obviously dreadnoughts are more of a pain to kill than other vehicles. So let's also look at how GT 2020 changed Abhor the Witch. So previously you got 5 points for killing a Psycho character, now you only get 3. And for killing a Psycho non-character, you only get 2 points versus 3. So I think this is still just an auto pick and auto max versus Grey Knights and Thousand Suns, as long as you kill enough units. But I think this will actually affect quite a few other matchups, where previously you could have, you were looking to get 10 plus points, probably 15 points, and you just now can't score it reliably. So let's see how important Abhor the Witch was, in general, and I suppose to Custodes. So obviously it's not going to be picked as often as Bring It Down, because lots of armies just don't have Psychers, and I think Psychers are more rare than vehicles or monsters. But when you did pick it, it did have a very, very high average points cost. Average points scored when you did pick it. So, as a Custodes player, when you ran into one of these matchups, being able to pick this Abhor the Witch kill secondary actually helped you a lot, because A, you were able to find like a good secondary to choose, and B, you were able to score highly in it. So again, I think if you look at your previous games, unless you're fighting Grey Knights or Thousand Suns, I think most lists that you were previously able to score 15 points on this are, you're now going to really struggle to get 12 plus points. And again, if you are scoring all of these points, are you actually, almost tabling your opponent? So I think this is actually a pretty big change, because there are quite a few armies that Abhor the Witch was pretty nice against, and now it's not really that great of an option. You know, you can still take it for 6 to 8 point secondary, but I think scoring 6 to 8 secondaries is not a good way to set yourself up to win the game. So one of the common kind of opponents that are affected that aren't Thousand Suns and Grey Knights, and I think it's Chaos. You know, if they ran lots of Keepers of Secrets, if they ran 3 Keepers, that was 15 points for Abhor the Witch. Now you're only looking at 9. It's not as good by quite a long way. You know, if they're running kind of Lords of Change, Magnus, Araman, they might only be running 3 or 4 of these, and now you're looking at max 12. Whereas if you'd only killed 3 of the 4 previously, you might be able to get 15 points. But again, this puts you in the potentially win more category. If you do that for kind of Magnus lists. On the Keeper of Secret sides, if that's their 3 Psykers and you're only getting 9 points if you kill all 3 of them, it's not anywhere near as good as scoring 15. Tyranids. Again, very frequently you'd be able to score 15 points from this because, Swarm Lord, Hive Tyrant, Brood Lord, Neurothrope, Zoanthropes, there's a few more that they could take, but I think these are the most common Psykers that you typically see from Tyranids. You're just not going to score as highly in this anymore. And obviously this is just going to reduce our ability to score highly in the secondary, and obviously scoring highly in secondaries is one of the ways that we win the game. There's a few other factions where previously they might have run 2 psychic characters, and you think, if you don't have other good secondaries to go for, you try and get 10 points if you kill them both. Now you're only going to get 6. Is that really good secondary to take? I don't think it is, because it's going to be hard to win really competitive games when you're only scoring 6 on your secondaries. So how do I think Warpcraft as a secondary category looks after the update? And I don't really like Abhor the Witch anymore. And so as a result, I think the opportunity cost for taking a Psyker and being closed out of taking Abhor the Witch just isn't that much of a cost. It can only really have upside. That's not to say you should immediately look into adding like a Psyker to your list. But I think that option should be considered very seriously when you look at your list and think, okay, what are the secondaries I can actually choose now? Because While We Stand We Fight might not be so good anymore. Grind Them Down certainly isn't as good anymore. Abhor the Witch isn't as good anymore. And effectively what that's done is, removed 3 of our secondary choices, which we were probably picking fairly often as a Custodes army. And you need to think, how do I build my list to score secondaries nicely? So Mental Interrogation, that one you're looking at 12 points max over the course of the game, unless you can get within 18 inches of a character turn 1. Obviously if your opponent knows that you've picked this, they can just hang them back an inch or 2 out of your maximum range, so they can stop that. But 12 points is not bad. Psychic Ritual, I don't think we really can soup in any like very tanky Psykers. We don't have any like monstrous Psykers that are really difficult to kill, and because this is an all or nothing secondary, if your Psyker does die, it's a bit of a disaster. So I personally don't like this as much. Pierce the Veil, I don't really see anybody taking this at the moment, but I think it's something to potentially look into because it has good synergy with Linebreaker and Teleport Homer, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on in the video. So what's the net effect of all the updates? So we got a few extra points probably, unless you weren't running any Shield Guard and you were only running Terminators and no bikes, that kind of a thing. Some of our harder matchups, they had some point increases, so the ones that immediately spring to mind are Eradicators and Scepters. For some of the Space Marine matchups against, particularly, I'm thinking Salamanders, White Scars, and Sisters of Battle, which I think are one of our roughest matchups. And they had very small point increases, but any point increase is nice from our perspective on their Repentia and Retributors. We lost 3 high-scoring secondaries spread out across 3 different categories. So that's our While We Stand We Fight, bring it down in Abhor the Witch. I know some people are excited about While We Stand We Fight going on to units instead of models. I'm just not one of those people, just again because I think we are expensive models, they need to be aggressive, and there's quite a high likelihood of the model of the unit being wiped in a close game. Um, the bring it down change means if you were shy to take 3 or 4 vehicles before because you were scared of bring it down, you no longer have to be. I think it's giving up 6 or 8 points for a secondary there just isn't that big of a deal anymore. So if you wanted to go that way, I think you should absolutely feel comfortable doing that. And I think the removal of a disincentive to take a few more vehicles has now been removed. So I think if anything, we may see more monsters vehicles in the meta. Not necessarily that we will, but I think it's more likely than not that we'll see a small increase of those kind of units. So the kind of conclusion you want to get to is we need to be building into secondaries at the list construction stage if we want to stay really competitive. Now, a lot of other army lists are already doing this because they've got, they just build their list to do scramblers every single game. Your Custodes list may or may not do that. They're building into maxing engage on all fronts every single game. Your army may or may not be doing that at the moment. And I think the removal of these kind of kill secondaries and the change to while we stand we fight means we should be looking to do that ASAP. So let's have a look at battlefield supremacy. Domination is again win more. It's got a little bit better with the change to scoring turn 5 if you're going seconds, but I think this is just strictly win more. So again, I don't really like picking this as a secondary. Engage on all fronts. I think if you don't have a lot of mobility or deep stroke in your army, you're not going to be scoring highly on engage on all fronts. So, if you're picking this regularly and you're scoring 6, 7, 8 points, there's probably room for improvement there. And I think good units to increase your scoring on engage on all fronts is something like the Ares or the Orion. Not that I'm particularly pushing the Orion as a unit, but in terms of increasing your points on engage, these flies would be amazing because obviously they've got very good movement ranges. They're not going to die very easily. And additionally, you can get good angles on targets that are trying to hide behind obscuring terrain. Palace, nice and fast. It's pretty cheap. If it dies, it's not the end of the world. And obviously it's diverting fire to some other units in your army that you may want not to get shot. So that's good. Bikes Venatari, obviously fast units, OBSEC, so that's good. And obviously deep striking units. Obviously they're only going to come in turn 2, but being able to immediately get to kind of all the table quarters is pretty nice. Now, another kind of way that you can do it is you can go for Line Breaker, and the kind of nice thing about Line Breaker is because you score 4 per turn, you can max this out more easily than you can max out engage on all fronts. Because obviously getting into 4 quarters on turn 1 for engage is pretty hard. But on the flip side of that, I think it does require a bit more commitment at army construction stage. And just keep in mind this excludes aircraft, so your Ares and Orion is not going to help you out here for Line Breaker. The other thing just to keep in mind is that some lists could just completely screen you out. So I'm thinking something like Orc Horde, Tyranid Horde, Space Marines if they're running a lot of infiltrators with their 12-inch denial bubbles can be pretty strong. So I wouldn't put all your eggs into this, but having this as an option is pretty nice because, again, what we're trying to really look for are ways to score different secondaries pretty reliably in as many matchups as possible. So let's have a look at shadow operations. Obviously raise the banners. I'll keep going on about this in my videos. If you get a good mission for it, it can be very reliable, 15 points. So just the main thing to do is make sure you've got 3 infantry in your list that you want to have starting on the board so that they can raise a banner turn 1. Obviously, not being able to raise a banner turn 1 is a pretty big deal actually because you're thinking, oh, I can raise it turn 2, but usually the opportunity cost of raising a banner turn 2 versus turn 1 is much bigger, obviously, because you're probably going to have more charge targets or more shooting targets versus turn 1. Where very often, if you're going first, you've got nothing you could shoot anyway, you've got nothing you could charge anyway. So the fact that you're raising a banner you don't feel bad about it. And I suppose a bit of a cautionary tale is be careful of picking banners against certain matchups or on certain maps. And that's if your deployments are very close to each other and your enemy has like a pre-turn 1 move and they get to go first, If they can get a model onto your objective, you can't raise a banner on it, right? Because you have to raise your banner at the end of your movement phase, and it's before you can shoot them or charge them or kill them or do any damage to them. So yeah, kind of very fast armies that have pre-turn 1 moves, they can stop banners going up. And additionally, something that caught me up recently by surprise are Tyranid Biovores. They'll move their Biovores to get a -1 to hit because they're intentionally trying to miss. And unless you've got one of your models precisely over the center of the objective, they'll be able to miss and put it within, somewhere on the primary, and now you can't score banners on it turn 1, and that can lose you the game if they're picking banners and they're getting their banners up turn 1 and you're getting 0 banners up turn 1. That can be pretty bad deal. Investigate sites. I still don't like this. I think it's just a bad secondary. It's very hard to stop your opponent just getting a model or a unit into the center of the map unless you're already just clearly winning. And again, I don't like win more secondaries. Deploy scramblers. Lots of armies are picking it. I think you should look seriously into putting capability into your list to deploy scramblers. So the thing that I want to mention with this is I see people fail a lot trying to deploy scramblers, and where they usually fail is when they don't dedicate a unit into deep strike or strategic reserves, and they try and kind of use a transport or advance units up the field to get to where they need to be, and that unit could just die. It could get shot off the board, it could get charged, it could get tagged in combat. Obviously, if you get tagged in combat, you can't fall back and do an action unless you've got some special rule or stratagem or something like that. Nothing springs immediately to mind right now as to something that can do that. But if you're thinking you might need to deploy scramblers on a semi-regular basis, you probably want to think at your list construction stage about what units will want to do this, and think about CP expenditure if you're going to need to strategically reserve them on the board. And I'm really thinking of Sisters of Silence here because they're our cheap unit without having to soup and spend additional CP for like a further detachment or something. Obviously, scramblers isn't something that immediately springs to mind in a Custodes army because you've got the opportunity cost for the fact that you're not shooting, you're not charging in a turn that you're doing an action, and Custodes units tend to be very expensive. Like 3 guard are about 150, maybe a bit less now, maybe like 145, something like that. But that's still quite a lot compared to kind of the cost that other armies, they can get like a 30-40 point unit to do scramblers. So potentially build into scramblers. Teleport Homer. This has to be infantry, but it can be a character now, which is nice. So again, I think this requires kind of strong commitment in your army construction stage as to whether or not you want to build your list to be able to take Teleport Homer. So I don't think there's any way to get infantry into your enemy deployment zone turn 1. So you're looking at a max 12 points. But if you deep strike your character in, your characters are, Custodes characters are pretty durable. And they've got relics and traits that can make them even more durable and not necessarily, that easy to kill. And especially if they're going in with another unit, for line breaker. And I'm thinking, here I'm really thinking Terminator Captain with a unit of Terminator, so they give lookout sir. It can be very hard to kind of kill this unit. So I don't particularly have much experience with line breaker Teleport Homer currently. It's definitely something that I'm going to be looking into with quite a lot of time following this update. But Ryan Snyder, if you don't know who he is, he's the top ITC Custodes player. He's been pushing this style of secondaries with line breaker and Teleport Homer for quite a while. So I think it's probably good, and with the way that GT has changed to remove some of our commonly picked kill secondaries, I definitely think this is something that people should be looking at in their lesson, and I think people should start experimenting with how it goes. But again, you've got to keep in mind, can you get screened up by some horde armies or units that have a lot of drops, or Space Marines that are taking infiltrators, because 12-inch bubbles of deny they're really big. It's a much bigger deal than having 3 units with 9-inch bubbles. 2 units with 12-inch bubbles can almost cover the majority of a deployment zone. so that can be a bit tricky. But you have to keep in mind, if you're now deep striking in, obviously you pick your secondaries before deployment, so they can kind of, they might decide to deep strike less stuff and start them on the board, etc. But again, if they do hold more units back for their backfield, it relieves pressure in the center of the board and makes it easier for you to score those primary points. So it's a bit of a give and take, but I think having access to take more secondaries is obviously just going to be much better moving forward. So yeah, the conclusion is build for as many secondaries as possible. So if you're going to need to pick and to engage on all fronts, you want to make sure you've got some fast units or deep striking units so you can score highly on it. Line breaker, have lots of deep striking units or fast units, and particularly ones that are hard to kill, so that they don't die immediately, and kind of give your other units that have started on the board time to get into their deployment zone if you need to kind of tag one out because a unit's about to die or something like that. Banners is always really nice, but it's not super reliable because it's very mission dependent. But just make sure you've got 3 infantry squads so that you can raise the banners. So just basically keep in mind, if you run a weird list and you don't have 3 infantry squads, it basically means you're not going to be able to score max on banners, which is pretty sad because the times it comes up, banners is a very strong secondary to pick. Can you go into scramblers? So do you have cheap infantry units? If you don't have cheap infantry units, again, you're going to pay a lot of points that aren't, they're not shooting, they're not charging, they're not effectively doing anything other than an action. So that can be quite expensive in terms of reduced output for your army. So I think yeah, unless you're souping, I think sisters are great here for scramblers, and you need to build into the list. You need to factor in the CP cost for the strategic reserve for them to come in from the table edge, because again, I think trying to walk sisters up the board to do scramblers is very, very risky. And again, the times that I've seen it fail, it fails because they just tried to walk units up the board. Even with a transport, it can be very difficult. If you dedicate some effort into killing them or tagging them in combat, that tends to be how they fail scramblers. And teleport homer, I think it's harder than scramblers because you have to do it repetitively, but it has a higher kind of ceiling because you can score 12 points with it if you do it every turn after turn 2. And also, if you're getting teleport homer, that means you're already in the deployment zone, and that's basically half of line breaker. So they've got good synergy here. So again, you want a durable unit that's not going to die. So I think like a shield captor and terminator armor is perfect here. And if you do somehow get tagged, they're very credible in combat. So they've got a good chance of cleaning them out in combat rounds, so that you can be free to do an action again in your turn. If you decide to take a psyker, mental interrogation, I think is an okay safety secondary. Again, once you're scoring this, if you're assuming you're scoring this from turn 2 onwards, that's 12 points. You don't care too much about the warp charge because these actions are quite easy to go off. And if you happen to fail one, which is pretty unlikely, but if you do, you can always just EP reroll it. And this is just a way of consistently scoring secondary points if you need to. And same thing with Pierce the Veil. I think most people would have never even really looked at Pierce the Veil. I've certainly not seen it in I think any of my matchups I've played, and I've played quite a lot. I think I'm only looking at it because I'm now really pushing the idea of line breaker and teleport homer. And obviously, if you're going to have people in their deployment zone deep striking anyway, if you deep strike in an Inquisitor to do this in that area, they're going to get the benefit of lookouts there as well, and they're helping to score line breaker, etc. I think it's probably not that bad. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the meta changes with these few kind of ways that GT has changed secondary scoring, and I think a lot of lists probably have built for enough kind of secondaries already, but I think some others were relying quite heavily on the kill secondaries, which have now been taken away from us. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the meta shifts, and let's see if I'm horribly wrong. I can get flamed in the comment section, or maybe it turns out somewhat correct. So we'll see. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you like the content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. All right, thanks very much.